Right now, we turn to the Pentagon's pundits. The corporate media's reliance on retired military officers for on-air commentary is well known. From the lead-up to the Iraq War to the present day, dozens of pro-war former military officials have appeared on the major news networks billed as impartial experts. This is a brief excerpt of the documentary Independent Media in a Time of War by the Hudson Mohawk Independent Media Center.
I would like tonight to call for a removal, an immediate removal, of all U.S. troops from CBS, ABC, NBC, Fox, CNN,
told by General Franks. The Embed program, I think, is just superb.
We have 3 aircraft carrier battle groups.
Still a great deal of activity.
Just like out of an action movie.
We've hit, we've struck. You can hear the sort of adrenaline pumping.
We are coming, and you can't do anything about it.
Don't believe the hype.
Media critics have long pointed out the discrepancy between the overwhelming number of pro-war military voices versus the almost complete absence of anti-war voices. It turns out the pro-war slant of military analysts was in fact part of a carefully orchestrated propaganda effort from the Pentagon. The New York Times has revealed the Pentagon recruited more than 75 retired military officers to appear on TV outlets as so-called military analysts ahead of the Iraq War. Newly disclosed Pentagon documents repeatedly refer to the military analysts as message force multipliers or surrogates who could be counted on to deliver administration themes and messages to millions of Americans in the form of their own opinions. The so-called analysts were given classified Pentagon briefings, provided with Pentagon-approved talking points, and given free trips to Iraq and other sites paid for by the Pentagon. Their involvement was ultimately approved by then Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld. Retired Green Beret Robert Bevilacqua, a former Fox News analyst, said, quote, "It was the Pentagon saying we need to stick our hands up your back and move your mouth for you." The Pentagon even hired a private contractor to monitor the analyst broadcast interviews. Brent Kruger, a senior official who helped oversee the propaganda effort, said, quote, "We were able to click on every single station and every one of our folks were up there delivering our message. You'd look at them and say, this is working." The propaganda campaign also extended into the nation's newspapers. 9 of the Pentagon-connected analysts wrote op-ed articles for the New York Times, and the Pentagon helped the retired military officers write a piece for the Wall Street Journal. Many of the same retired military officers also have ties to military contractors vested in the very war policies they were asked to assess on air. In interviews, at least 2 so-called analysts admitted to deliberately tempering their on-air comments out of fear of losing military contracts for their firms. Officials from NBC, CBS, ABC, and CNN all admitted to being unaware of their analysts' business interests in the war. Fox News declined to comment for the New York Times. The Times reports the Pentagon continues to use the analysts in a propaganda campaign to generate favorable news coverage of the administration's wartime performance. For more on this story, I'm joined by 2 guests. Peter Hart, Activism Director at Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, known as FAIR in New York. He writes for FAIR's magazine Extra and is also co-host of FAIR's syndicated radio show Counterspin. Joining on the phone from Virginia, Colonel Sam Gardner, retired Air Force colonel. He's taught strategy and military operations at the National War College, Air War College, and Naval War College. Let's begin with you, Sam Gardner, your response to the expose in the Times.
Well, I think that there are about 4 or 5 levels of problems here. The most profound and the most painful is the disdain of the Pentagon for democracy. I mean, think about it. What we have seen, this is a part of the campaign. They don't believe in democracy. They don't believe that the American people, if given the truth, will come to a good decision. That's very painful. The second thing is about the military analysts themselves. They were being given these briefings, no, but none of them ever said that they were provided this inside information. And then I think the third thing is that the networks themselves, they wanted cheerleaders, and they could have, without knowing the background that the analysts were being given inside information, they wanted cheerleaders, and they knew that cheerleaders gave them access. So, I mean, there are really some serious problems from top to bottom on this.
Peter Hart, your take on this. You've been looking at the media, critiquing how the networks and the press have covered this war.
I think FAIR's been talking about this for 20-plus years, so there isn't a surprise in the sense that the media rely on these retired military officials for perspective in covering any war. What I think is surprising and distressing is the media aspect of it. The Pentagon trying to get its story out is no surprise, and the Times focused on that. The Times spent less time talking about the media's role as accomplices in this propaganda operation, and I think that's what's important when you look at who they relied on and combine that with the fact that they were talking to current military officials and current government officials. You have an overwhelming source pool that is dominated by people who support this war or any war. So it's not surprising that this was going on. I think the extent of the briefings was somewhat shocking, and the blasé attitude from the networks. They didn't care what military contractors these guys were representing when they were out of the studio. They didn't care that the Pentagon was flying them on their own dime to Iraq. Just basic journalistic judgment was completely lacking here. So I think the story is really about a media failure more than a Pentagon failure. The Pentagon did exactly what you would expect to do, taking advantage of this media bias in favor of having more and more generals on the air when the country's at war.
In this piece in the New York Times is the role of Tori Clark, Victoria Clark, who at the time was Pentagon spokesperson. Peter Hart, now she is an ABC commentator. Can you talk about the setting up of this program?
Well, I think they took advantage of something that they understood to exist in the media already, a preference for these retired military officers to come in and give perspective about the war. So they started in 2002, understood that these guys actually get more airtime than many of the anchors on CNN and NBC. So they went to them and said, look, we'll supply you with talking points, special briefings with Don Rumsfeld. I think by the Times count there were 18 meetings with Donald Rumsfeld in his private briefing room. They set out the good china when they arrived. So the Pentagon knew that they could spin these stories, and they were remarkably successful. One of the most shocking things in the story is that in early 2003, these guys got a briefing about WMDs, and the government said, we actually don't have hard evidence right now that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. Did any of them go on the air and say that? No. The Pentagon, I think, had total control and total faith that these guys would deliver the message that they intended to deliver to the public, and that's exactly what they did, and the media did very little to counteract this overwhelming propaganda campaign from the Pentagon.
Colonel Gardner, can you talk about psychological operations, PSYOP, something you are a specialist in, and whether you see this fitting in?
Well, Amy, it was part of a campaign, and you and I have talked about this before. The campaign that the Pentagon designed had three elements. One element was to dominate the news 24/7. I was at a conference in London in the summer of 2003 at which the Pentagon communication consultant John Rendon spoke and gave an assessment of how they had done in the run-up to the war. And he said, well, there were three things we tried to do, and we did well on two, but not the third. The first was to make the news be theirs 24/7, and they did that by the morning briefings from Baghdad or from Kuwait, and then the afternoon press conference from the Pentagon. We wanted to control the printed media, and that was primarily done by the embedded program. He said the one thing we failed at was we didn't have people who provided the context. We lost control of the military analysts, and they were giving context. So it was about 60 days after that presentation that the Pentagon began this meeting with the military analysts. And I might point out that it was only those who generally agreed. People who had been saying critical things were never invited to this. I was never invited. And I had been saying critical things about the number of troops and, about the argument for the war and even WMD, but didn't get invited. People that were generally supportive of the Pentagon were the ones that were invited. But it was certainly part of, and this is where I think I fault the Pentagon, and we're on very close to violating the law. They are prohibited from doing propaganda against the American people. And when you put together the campaign that Tory Clark did with these three elements, you're very close to a violation of the law.